Welcome to midterm. At this point, I hope you're feeling very comfortable about our public health system because now we'll be moving into health policy and administration. We start off Module 4 with the overarching level of the ecological model, policy. In this module, we analyze a given policy by identifying the social, political, economic, and ethical values and assumptions, all concepts we've been considering throughout the semester, especially in our various case studies and other public health matters and assignments. And then thinking about how these concepts and assumptions have influenced a specific piece of policy and its development and implementation, and then apply this to a policy analysis framework to the evaluation of potential policy alternatives. And then, given this current public health policy issue, we'll design an advocacy strategy for a specific public health policy reform. So it's not too early to begin to think about what bill or piece of legislation you want to focus on for next week when we develop our tools. You're welcome to continue the same public health topic or a policy that addresses the public health issue that you've selected for our last module in Module 3, or you're welcome to select a new topic. Now moving in to the Module 4 case studies. These case studies from this module provide examples of public health policy as well as its implications. These case studies can even begin to give you ideas for the Module 4 tools. The mandatory premarital testing for HIV case study exemplifies the policy cycle stages. World's first public health mayor case study provides another illustration of the conflict between individual liberties versus the public good, as we considered for our HPV vaccination case study. Jumping right into the mandatory premarital testing case study, back in December of '82, a report in the MMWR described 3 AIDS cases from whole blood transfusions. By '83, widespread recognition of the problem of transfusion-related AIDS led to controversial recommendations that those in known high-risk groups voluntarily defer from donating blood. Then by June of '84, after the discovery of AIDS, of HIV actually, 5 companies were licensed to produce ELISA test kits for detecting HIV antibody. Now, fast forward to 1987. More than 60 legislative proposals were introduced into the state legislature. About 3/4 of these called for testing various subgroups in the population, including food handlers, teachers, public safety personnel, and marriage license applicants. Interpreting this case study really focuses on science. Actually, some of the concepts that you've learned in EPI last semester, as they can provide sound evidence for considering the implications of a mandatory premarital HIV screening mandate. So going back and reviewing some of the EPI methods that you've learned last semester, this study forces us to revisit sensitivity, or a true positive, over a total positive, specificity, a true negative over the total negative, the positive predictive value, which is the true positive over the total test positive, and a negative predictive value, which is the true negative over the total test negative. As I am sure you already gather, these values are not at the core of this course, but understanding the implications of public health policy, what makes an effective public health policy, and how to evaluate its effectiveness is what this study shows us. So the next slides look at the case study through this lens. These next slides, again, also serve as a nice little review of some EPI methods. So please look through these slides on your own. We'll start with a prevalence of 50% and how to think about predictive value positive and a predictive value negative, as well as sensitivity and specificity when it's at the 95% and 98%. And the rest of the slides provide examples as such. So flip through these slides quickly or more carefully if you want a more thorough review, because then you'll be able to refer back to sensitivity and specificity and predictive value and how it intersects with our study. With that brief review of sensitivity and specificity and predictive value, think about our case study that forecasted an expected yield from testing 200,000 marriage license applicants that included a false positivity rate of 4 per 200,000, or that's zero point 0.2 per 10,000. That means 72 true positives and 8 false negatives. Now review our case study's estimates of yield. What do you think? Studies of the use of multiple laboratories performing serial tests at the time of this case study suggest the background false positivity rate was even likely higher, about 1 per 10,000. If the background false positivity rate for serial testing in a specific population was 1 per 10,000 persons tested, how many false positives would have there been if we tested 250,000 individuals? Right, 25. And what proportion of positive tests would be false if this testing sequence yielded 4 positives per 10,000? A quarter, 25%. What proportion of false positive tests would be false if this testing sequence yielded 2 positives per 10,000? 50%. What are the implications of these rates? Now compute the cost of the screening program for these 200,000 individuals. Assume a total cost of $50 for every initial EIA test, a $10 lab fee, and a $40 healthcare provider visit, and an additional $100 for EIA positive persons who will need additional testing. What would be the cost of the screening program in the next year? And then what's the cost per antibody positive person identified? Now, going back to the social, political, and media implications, what might have happened in the period between 85 and 87 to prompt increased political and legislative attention to the AIDS epidemic? Why do you think so many proposals focused on testing various subgroups in the population? Review the data summarized in the JAMA article as well as maybe some of these headlines. Does this information support your initial recommendation and arguments? Are there other factors that you would not have predicted that eventually may have contributed to the legislature's and governor's decision to repeal this law? I look forward to learning of your thoughts in this next conferencing exercise. What role did the media likely play, then, in the various stages of this controversy? How do you think the media portrayed the different portions on mandatory premarital HIV testing? What role did political considerations play in the various stages of this controversy? How do you think the various political viewpoints portrayed the different positions on mandatory premarital testing? Which effects of this legislation were anticipated based on the science in this case study? And which effects were not anticipated? And what role did anticipated effects have on the subsequent repeal of this legislation? And what about the role of unanticipated effects? Which effects, anticipated or unanticipated, likely had the greatest impact on the repeal of mandatory premarital HIV antibody testing in Illinois? As you think about your response to this case study, to the questions in the prompt, what characteristics, principles, or criteria make for a good screening test? How does this particular application for the screening test rate when judged by these characteristics, principles, or criteria for health screening tests? Consider some of these criteria. With these considerations informed by the EPI slides you also just reviewed, what criteria are used in evaluating mass screening programs? Which two criteria would you consider to be most important in evaluating the proposed premarital HIV testing program? And identify a key factor that helped contribute to its repeal. And this will be the question prompt that you'll respond to for this case study. Now let's shift gears to the world's first public health mayor case study. I added this ecological model back from my school-based obesity prevention work as a reminder of how policy fits into the public health infrastructure and system. And because the relentless obesity epidemic is the backdrop of this case study. The key points here, as well as the key learning objectives, have to do with how we decide when to legislate, what to legislate, and how to judge, evaluate that is, efficacy. Public health ethics, as we discussed in our first week, also play a key role here. This case study revisits the conflict between individual liberties versus the public good. So, taking a look at some examples, public health policy and conflict between individual liberties versus the public good. In New York City, on January 22, 2008, the New York City Board of Health approved an amendment to the city's health code requiring certain food service establishments to post calorie information prominently on menu boards and menus where consumers may see this information when they order. They also approved a ban on the sale of sugary drinks larger than 16 ounces at restaurants and concession stands. And for example, in Chicago, pop machines, as you say in Chicago, in Chicago government buildings would carry calorie information, and city workers would be able to win cash in a health competition paid for by Coca-Cola and other beverage giants. Now it's time to visit our discussion board and post your thoughts about each of these case studies as well as our additional resources. Thank you once again for tuning in.